Hi, I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about an approach different from all others except for two of my former students, an approach to radiocarbon sampling, which has some advantages over normal radiocarbon sampling done in traditional fashion. This is a technique that was developed approximately 30 years ago and introduced into the Office of Archaeological Studies about 10 years ago. I want to talk a little bit about the carbon production, radiocarbon production, and its cycle in the atmosphere. It's the basis for radiocarbon dating. In the upper atmosphere, cosmic rays bombard the atmosphere. It forms, among other things, neutrons. Those neutrons react with the most common isotope of nitrogen, nitrogen-14, and that combination results in carbon-14. Carbon-14 then quickly oxidizes to carbon dioxide, CO2, and mixes quickly, in a matter of a couple of months, in the atmosphere. After it's mixed in the atmosphere, it's picked up by plants that breathe carbon dioxide, and then everything else is, the food chain is based on that. So animals eat the plants and die. The plants also die. The animals are eaten by humans who also die, and so on. And it's an exciting part of radiocarbon dating that virtually all of those things, the plants, the animals, bacteria, any living organism almost, to a first approximation, develops the same level of carbon-14. And upon death, carbon-14, being radioactive, starts decaying away, but it stays constant until the organism dies. You're familiar with this process that's going on if you've ever seen the Northern Lights, because that's where the cosmic rays interact with the upper atmosphere, causing ions which give the color to the beautiful sky of the northern part. As I said, these reactions that you see in the color here are producing neutrons. Those neutrons react with nitrogen-14 and form carbon-14. Once the organism dies, the carbon-14 decays in the known way with the known, we call it half-life. That means that after the 7,030 years that's put there, half of the radiocarbon that we started out with has gone. If we go another 5,730 years, it's down to a quarter. If we go another 5,730 years, it's down to an eighth, and so on. Consequently, we can measure the number of carbon-14 atoms remaining in a sample and relate that to the time of death, and that gives us the age of an archaeological artifact. The difference in our technique and others is we use the device that's shown here. It's a plasma system. A plasma is just a slightly ionized gas. Our major actor in that is pure oxygen, and we put pure oxygen into the system at about 1,000th of the pressure of the atmosphere. That is to say, it's a vacuum. And we put a radio frequency potential, voltage potential, on the electrode, and that slightly ionizes the oxygen. The slightly ionized oxygen is very reactive compared to oxygen in the atmosphere, where it would take, say, 20 or 30 years to oxidize a piece of metal in just laying on Earth. It can be done in a plasma unit in a matter of an hour or so. This shows the apparatus from the top and shows the five chambers. In this case, we've got argon plasmas going in all the chambers, which are numbered. And as with the northern lights, the ionized argon produces a colorful glow, in this case, a pale blue glow. There are some advantages to the plasma oxidation over the traditional way of dealing with radiocarbon samples. First, we can use very small samples. 30 to 100 micrograms is all that the Swiss Accelerator Mass Spectrometer Lab that measures the radiocarbon content asks us for. And that's 30 millionth of a gram, which is difficult to see with the naked eye. In the regular traditional radiocarbon sampling, they have to use hot acid treatment to make sure there's no carbonate or oxalate, which would affect their dates. But the plasma technique ignores those substances, the carbonates and the oxalates, and consequently, the strong acid treatment is unnecessary. Typically, about 2/3 of the sample is reacted away by this hot acid treatment. We can, under certain circumstances, do virtually non-destructive radiocarbon dates. Plasmas are able to react with the artifact in many, many cases without any visible change to the artifact. So we can put something like a turkey feather in the system and take enough carbon out to do 4 radiocarbon dates and can't tell that there's been any change to the feather, for instance, or a piece of corn or a piece of wood or whatever the artifact may be. Masking is possible if you have a sample that has an identification number written on with India ink. That India ink would mess up a radiocarbon date, but we're able to cover that with either aluminum foil or aluminum oxide and be able to get a date without interference from the carbon-bearing substance that was added. And it's also possible to collect multiple dates from a single small sample. So in a typical radiocarbon dating lab, the sample they take is totally destroyed. It's burned, totally burned in the atmosphere. Ours is just reacting with the oxygen plasma. And so we can react it serially and take as many samples as we want, or as many samples as it's possible to extract from the sample. So that's an advantage. To illustrate the non-destructive dating technique, there's a picture here showing 4,500-year-old radiocarbon standard wood. And we show the picture before dating and after dating, and that's within the limits of the photography and the microscopic enlargement. Here you can not see any difference in these two pieces of wood. They could, that being an artifact, could be used over and over to do other studies. The next slide shows a much closer view, and in that case you can see along the right-hand edge where the wood has been split in this paper thin, that in some cases you can see where some of the wood has actually been oxidized off of the sample. So it's not ideally able to do non-destructive testing, but it's virtually that. That same wood has been used to show that our system gives results that are comparable to other laboratories in the world. The upper part of this sigmoid graph is the radiocarbon dates from all the radiocarbon laboratories in the world. And the one below, which shows 14 or so radiocarbon dates, are our dates. And the consensus date from all the other radiocarbon labs is 4,508, and we get 4,538 years, which is complete agreement within the uncertainty of the measurement. So we're confident that we get the right answer. We've also used many other standards, some of which I may mention later. One of the standards is a Coptic textile, which on the left is shown one of them, not necessarily the one we studied. Here are two other examples. Coptic textiles are mostly from Egypt, and they're usually 1,000 to 2,000 years old, something roughly like that. This is a Coptic textile standard that we had, and again, illustrating the non-destructive nature of the process. We've taken enough samples for about 20 dates off here, and you still can't, within the limits of our photography, see any change in that sample. Oops. We were given a supposed Coptic textile and asked if the date would be compatible with it being Coptic. The textile is shown here as it arrived to us, except that when it arrived to us, it was between two plexiglass plates, which have been removed for this photograph. In the photograph, you can see what supposedly is Jesus wearing a halo. In the Coptic situation, only Jesus wore halos, and so that supposedly, not where him, had a halo. And it also shows some insect poop, the little dark dots that are around the edge of it. Apparently, after it had been put in the plexiglass plates, insects had gotten in and lived off of the textile and the dyes in the textile. So with a closer view, you can see the indigo colored insect poop. There's a piece of undyed linen, similar to the one that we dated, and I'll show you in a moment. And you can see the dark blue indigo dye, commonplace in Egypt during Coptic times, an unknown orange dye. And if you look at the bottom, the insect poop has orange color, and it has dark blue color, and it has the undyed linen color. So you can tell what each represents as the diet, whether it's an indigo dye or the orange dye or the undyed linen. This shows the undyed linen that we radiocarbon dated. The picture on the left side on the top shows it before any plasmas were taken. On the right-hand side, it shows it after we had taken enough for 4 radiocarbon dates. And you can see that there's virtually no change, and that fiber has been archived and can be used for further studies in the future. We also separated out some of the indigo colored insect poop, and that's shown on the left side before we did any plasmas, and on the right side it's shown after we did 4 plasmas. Then you could watch, as we went through those 4 plasmas, watch the indigo dye color vanishing, leaving behind simply the color of the undyed linen. The linen thread was dated to 1360 radiocarbon years, the insect poop to 1350, which is perfect, essentially perfect agreement. And so we can get the radiocarbon age off of the insect poop just as well as we could do off the Coptic textile, so we could have made it completely non-destructive to the textile had we known this in advance. Human coprolites, fossilized feces, have been radiocarbon dated in the past, but as far as we know, nobody's radiocarbon dated insect poop. So we made the Guinness Book of Records, I suppose. This is a mummy, infant mummy burial from Texas. We took many different pieces of this: grass, twine, ash wood stick, a sotol stalk, some rabbit fur robe, a bone with a little bit of dried flesh on it, and we radiocarbon dated, extracted carbon dioxide out and radiocarbon dated all of those. And this picture again shows that the process is essentially non-destructive. You can't really tell any difference within the limits of our photography. I did something strange. And it's non-destructive as far as one can tell. It does sometimes change the color, as it did on the twine up the upper left-hand corner, central left-hand, where it bleached the twine a little bit in one circumstance, but that's the only change. This shows the dates that were obtained on those materials, and basically shows that everything we dated gave the same age except the ash stick. The mummy came to the University of Texas in a suitcase, and the ash stick was part of it, but obviously because of the date of the ash, it cannot be part of that infant burial. This just shows our part of our checking of known standards: charcoal 4, 3, 2 and 1, peyote, teary wood, Russian textile, Coptic textile, leather, and the ash wood, all showing that we are in agreement with the expected dates. We began studying rock paintings, and some of them are really easy to date. This one says in 1969, man landed on the moon. So presumably that was done near 1969. And this one was dated to June the 8th, 1884. During the 1980s, a railroad train track crew was going through the lower Pecos region of Texas, and this guy signed and dated a pictograph. So that's too easy. Others you can date a little bit, that is, restrict the date by looking at what's pictured. Here there's a church and a nattily dressed Spaniard, so that the pictograph here has to be 500 years old or less, depending as it would on the arrival of the Spanish before it was painted. This one shows it's strange, an atlatl being held in the hand of this human-like figure, though not really a human figure. And the atlatl was introduced in Texas about 3,600 years ago. This pictograph is from Texas, and we dated 30 or so of this style of pictograph that dated between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. So the presence of the atlatl gives you some idea of how old the painting was. In this one, they're holding a bow and arrow, and the expected date range, the University of Texas archaeologists said, was between 650 and 1,350 years ago. And the plasma date we got was between 880 and 1260 years ago, in pretty good agreement. So we feel confident that we can date this kind of pictographs, these kinds of pictographs, fairly accurately. We were asked by the National Park Service to determine if this was an authentic pictograph or if it was painted in modern times. There was some people argued that a cowboy had come out of the wilderness there in Utah and said that he painted it. So the Park Service wanted to know if it was authentic or not. To the left is a building that they say was between 650 and 850 years old. And the date on this so-called All-American Man pictograph was 650 years ago. It's about a meter tall. So it was apparently authentic, painted at the time that building was being used. In Guatemala, there's a cave, and a man is shown there to give scales, fairly large cave. It's the only cave, it's the only rock art we know that we could call a standard, because written into this Mayan script is the date of the painting, presumably the date of the painting, there's a date, and we managed to get the same age within error by dating one of these as well. We were also given a bust of Jesus. The provenance history was that the bust had been brought over on the British ship, the Mayflower, in 1620. So the question was, would the date on that be compatible with it being brought over on the Mayflower? And sure enough, the date said it was made in 1620 or a few years earlier, which would have been compatible with the assertion that it came over on the Mayflower. Doesn't prove it came over on the Mayflower, but the date would allow it to have been brought over on the Mayflower, so it's at least feasible. We were also given a piece of a canvas from a painting that was signed Picasso and dated 7/3/55, which in the European way of writing things would have been March the 7th, 1955. And this was supposed to have been one of Picasso's mistresses. It turned out, however, when we radiocarbon dated it, that it was a fake. The date was later than the signed date of 1955, and so it couldn't have been produced as it was said on the canvas in 1955. And that concludes the talk. Thank you very much.